I was standing in the bathroom mirror, practicing my own eulogy, when I heard David downstairs telling Amanda I'd finally done it. His voice carried up through the heating vents as clear as day. She took the pills last night. The paramedics couldn't save her. Sarah's gone. The relief in his voice made my blood run cold. For 3 months, I'd been listening to him tell his mistress that his suicidal wife was getting worse, that I was becoming dangerous, that he feared for his safety. What he didn't know was that I'd been planning something far more permanent than suicide. I was planning to disappear completely and let him live with the consequences of wishing me dead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Riverside, Ohio. I was making coffee in our kitchen on Maple Street when David came downstairs already dressed for his job at Midwest Family Insurance. He kissed my forehead with the same mechanical precision he'd used for the past 6 months, grabbed his travel mug, and headed for the door. No conversation, no eye contact, just the hollow routine of a marriage that had died somewhere along the way. I should have known something was wrong when he started working late every Tuesday and Thursday. David had been an insurance adjuster for 12 years, and his schedule had always been predictable. Suddenly, he was investigating complex fraud cases that required evening meetings and weekend consultations. When I asked about the extra hours, he'd get defensive, accusing me of being paranoid and controlling. "Sarah, you don't understand the pressure I'm under at work. These cases are complicated, and if I don't handle them properly, people could lose everything." The first real warning sign came when I found the second phone charger in his car. David had always been meticulous about his belongings, and finding an extra charger that didn't match his usual phone seemed odd. When I mentioned it, he claimed his work phone had died and the company issued him a temporary replacement. The explanation made sense, but something about his delivery felt rehearsed. 3 weeks later, I noticed changes in his behavior that were impossible to ignore. David started taking showers immediately when he came home, claiming the insurance office was dusty and made him feel grimy. He'd always been casual about hygiene after work, often staying in his work clothes until bedtime. The sudden obsession with cleanliness struck me as unusual, but I convinced myself I was overthinking things. The real shift happened when David started commenting on my mental health. He'd make casual observations about my stress levels, suggesting I seemed overwhelmed or anxious. "Sarah, you've been really tense lately. Maybe you should talk to someone professional." These comments felt supportive at first, like a caring husband noticing his wife's emotional state, but they became more frequent and specific, with David pointing out behaviors I wasn't even aware of exhibiting. One evening in early October, David suggested I should consider therapy. We were watching television when he muted the volume during a commercial and turned to me with sudden seriousness. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week about your anxiety. Dr. Patricia Wells has excellent reviews online, and she specializes in helping people work through major life transitions." I wasn't aware we'd had any conversation about my anxiety, and I certainly hadn't mentioned wanting therapy. When I pointed this out, David looked genuinely confused. "Sarah, we talked about this on Sunday morning. You said you were having trouble sleeping and feeling disconnected from things that used to make you happy." His certainty made me question my own memory, wondering if I'd somehow forgotten an entire conversation about my mental health. That night, I lay awake replaying our recent interactions, trying to remember when I'd expressed feelings of anxiety or depression. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that these conversations had never happened. David was creating a narrative about my mental state that didn't align with my actual experiences. The breaking point came 3 weeks later when I decided to grab lunch at Brew and Bean Cafe downtown.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I was waiting in line when I heard David's voice from a corner booth. He was talking to someone I couldn't see, but his words made my heart stop. "She's getting worse every day. Last night she was talking about how everyone would be better off without her. I'm genuinely afraid she might hurt herself." I moved closer, pretending to study the menu board while straining to hear more. The woman's voice was unfamiliar, soft and concerned. "David, that sounds really serious. Have you considered getting her professional help?" Her tone was intimate, caring in a way that suggested this wasn't their first conversation about my supposed mental health crisis. I've tried suggesting therapy, but she gets defensive and angry. She accuses me of trying to control her or make her seem crazy. David's voice carried the weight of a long-suffering husband dealing with an unstable wife. "Amanda, I don't know how much more of this I can handle. Living with someone who's actively suicidal is destroying my own mental health." Amanda. The name hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard David mention an Amanda from work a few times, always in passing references to colleagues and office dynamics. But this conversation suggested a relationship that went far beyond professional interaction. The intimacy in their voices, the way she listened to his concerns about me, the casual way he shared deeply personal information about our marriage, all pointed to something much more significant. I stayed hidden behind the menu board, my hands shaking as I listened to David construct an elaborate fiction about my mental state. According to his version of events, I'd been spiraling into depression for months. I was having mood swings, making concerning statements about death, and becoming increasingly isolated from friends and family. None of this was true, but David delivered each detail with convincing sincerity. The worst part is that she started talking about suicide like it's a reasonable solution to her problems, David continued. "Last weekend, she asked me what I'd do if something happened to her. When I pressed for details, she said I'd probably be relieved to start fresh without all her emotional baggage." Amanda's response revealed the depth of their relationship. "Honey, you can't live like this. You're not responsible for her choices, and you can't sacrifice your own happiness trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." The endearment, the advice, the way she spoke about our marriage as if she had intimate knowledge of our dynamics, all pointed to something much more significant. I stayed hidden behind the menu board, my hands shaking as I listened to David construct an elaborate fiction about my mental state. That evening, I confronted David about the conversation I'd overheard. His reaction was immediate and aggressive. "Sarah, you followed me to a coffee shop? That's exactly the kind of paranoid behavior I was talking about. You're stalking me now, eavesdropping on private conversations?" His ability to flip the situation and make me the villain was masterful and terrifying. When I pressed him about Amanda and their obvious intimacy, David's story became more elaborate. "Amanda is a nurse at Riverside General. She's been helping me understand the warning signs of suicide because she deals with mental health crises in her work. I'm trying to get professional advice about how to help you, and you're turning it into something inappropriate." His explanation was plausible enough to create doubt, but I knew what I'd heard. The tone of their conversation, the casual way he discussed our private life, the endearment she'd used, all pointed to a romantic relationship that had been developing for months. David was using my supposed mental health crisis as cover for his affair, while simultaneously building a case for why my eventual disappearance would be understandable and expected. Over the next 2 weeks, I began paying closer attention to David's behavior and comments.
He started documenting my supposed symptoms more aggressively, often in front of his stepson Jake, who lived with us part-time. "Sarah seemed really disconnected during dinner tonight," he'd say to Jake after I'd gone upstairs. "I'm worried about her, but she won't let me help." Jake, who was 17 and perceptive, started giving me concerned looks and asking if I was okay. David's campaign to establish my mental instability was working on everyone around us. Friends began treating me with careful sympathy, family members called to check on my emotional state, and even my coworkers started asking if I was handling stress well. The most disturbing part was how David's fictional narrative began affecting my actual mental health. Being constantly told that I seemed depressed, anxious, and unstable started making me question my own perceptions. When everyone around you believes you're mentally ill, it becomes increasingly difficult to trust your own judgment about reality. One evening in November, I overheard David on a phone call that changed everything. I was coming downstairs to get water when I heard him in his home office, speaking in the low, intimate tone I'd recognized from the coffee shop. She asked me about life insurance policies today, Amanda. She wanted to know how much money I'd get if something happened to her. I think she's getting closer to actually doing something. Amanda's voice was barely audible through the phone, but I could make out her response. David, maybe that's not entirely bad. If she's determined to hurt herself anyway, at least you'd be free to start over. We could finally be together without all this drama. The casual way they discussed my potential suicide as a convenient solution to their relationship problems made me physically ill. They weren't just hoping I'd disappear, they were actively anticipating it as the best possible outcome for their future together. David's response confirmed my worst fears about their relationship and his long-term plans. "I've been thinking the same thing," David said quietly. "If Sarah follows through on her threats, it would solve a lot of problems. I'd have the life insurance money to start fresh, and we wouldn't have to deal with the complications of a messy divorce. Sometimes I think the best thing for everyone involved would be if she just finally did what she keeps threatening to do." Standing in the hallway, listening to my husband and his mistress discuss the benefits of my suicide, I realized that David had moved beyond simply having an affair. He was actively hoping for my death and building a narrative that would make it seem inevitable. Every comment about my mental health, every suggestion that I was unstable, every conversation with friends and family about my supposed depression was creating a foundation for explaining my eventual absence. That night, I lay in bed next to David, watching him sleep peacefully while I processed the full scope of his betrayal. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was systematically destroying my reputation and mental health credibility while fantasizing about collecting life insurance money after my suicide. The man I'd been married to for 8 years was actively working toward my death as the most convenient solution to his relationship problems. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. If David wanted me to disappear so badly, I would give him exactly what he was hoping for. But instead of suicide, I would stage my own death and start a completely new life. David would get to experience the reality of losing me, but without the financial benefits he was anticipating. And I would finally be free from a marriage that had become a systematic campaign to drive me towards self-destruction. The plan that began forming in my mind that sleepless November night was complex and risky, but it felt like the only way to escape David's psychological manipulation while ensuring he faced real consequences for his actions. If he wanted to tell everyone I was suicidal, I would use that narrative against him in ways he never saw coming. The next morning brought a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. As David went through his usual routine of brewing coffee and checking his phone, I watched him with new eyes. Every gesture, every casual comment, every seemingly innocent question about my day took on sinister meaning. When he asked if I slept well, I recognized it as data collection for his ongoing narrative about my deteriorating mental state. "I had some strange dreams," I told him, testing how he'd respond to anything that could be interpreted as concerning. David's face immediately shifted to what I now recognized as his practiced expression of spousal worry. His eyebrows drew together in precisely the right way to convey caring concern, and his voice took on the patient tone he'd been perfecting for months. "What kind of strange dreams, Sarah? You've been having a lot of restless nights lately." There it was again, the insertion of symptoms I hadn't reported. According to David's version of reality, I'd been suffering from sleep disturbances that I wasn't even aware of experiencing. I realized he'd been building this fictional medical history for much longer than I'd initially understood. "Just weird scenarios that didn't make much sense," I replied vaguely, curious to see how far he'd push for details that he could later use as evidence of my declining mental state. David set down his coffee cup and moved closer, his face a mask of husband-like concern that now seemed grotesquely theatrical. "Sarah, I've been thinking we really should make that appointment with Dr. Wells. These sleep issues, combined with everything else you've been experiencing, suggest you might benefit from professional support. His ability to reference everything else as if there had been a long list of documented problems was both impressive and terrifying. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with David skillfully weaving together isolated comments I'd made over recent weeks to create a tapestry of mental health decline. A joke about Monday morning blues became evidence of persistent sadness. My observation that winter weather made everyone feel sluggish was transformed into concerning social withdrawal. My perfectly normal comment about feeling tired after a long workday was reframed as chronic fatigue that indicated deeper psychological issues. Watching David perform this manipulation in real time was like getting a masterclass in psychological warfare. He wasn't simply lying about my mental state, he was taking genuine fragments of normal human experience and recontextualizing them to support his narrative of my gradual breakdown. The most disturbing part was how reasonable he made it all sound, even to me. After David left for work, I sat at our kitchen table and began making lists. If I was going to disappear permanently, I needed to understand every aspect of our shared life that would require careful handling. Bank accounts, social media profiles, work obligations, family relationships, shared possessions, legal documents, insurance policies, and dozens of other interconnected elements that make up a modern adult existence. The financial aspect was particularly complex. David and I had joint checking and savings accounts, but I also maintained a small personal account from before our marriage that contained about $8,000. It wasn't much, but it would provide the foundation for establishing a new identity. I'd need to gradually move money without creating patterns that David might notice, especially given his background in insurance fraud investigation. More challenging was the emotional preparation required to permanently leave behind everyone I cared about. My sister Lisa in Portland would be devastated by news of my death. My coworkers at the marketing firm would be shocked and confused. Our neighbors, who'd watched me garden and walk our dog for years, would struggle to reconcile David's claims about my mental state with their own observations of my apparently normal behavior. The psychological weight of allowing people to believe I'd committed suicide felt enormous. Lisa had struggled with depression in college, and news of my death would likely trigger painful memories and guilt about not recognizing warning signs. My parents, who were already dealing with my father's early-stage dementia, would be crushed by losing their daughter to mental illness they'd never suspected. But the alternative was remaining trapped in a marriage where my husband was actively hoping for my death while building a public case for why my suicide would be unsurprising. David's systematic destruction of my reputation and credibility had backed me into a corner where dramatic action felt like the only path to genuine freedom. The planning phase required research into areas I'd never previously considered. How do people successfully disappear in an age of digital surveillance? What documentation is required to establish a new identity? How can someone die convincingly without leaving a body that proves otherwise? These questions led me down internet rabbit holes that were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. I discovered that staged disappearances were more common than I'd realized, though successful ones required meticulous planning and often involved circumstances that provided plausible explanations for missing bodies. Hiking accidents in remote areas, boating incidents in deep water, and winter sports mishaps in avalanche zones all offered possibilities for disappearances where remains might never be recovered. The location I eventually settled on was Pine Lake Cabins, a remote resort area about 2 hours north of Riverside. The lake was deep, surrounded by dense woods, and had a history of drowning accidents where bodies were never found. More importantly, it was the kind of place where someone might plausibly go to contemplate suicide, especially if they've been struggling with mental health issues for months. Creating the logistics for my disappearance required thinking like David, anticipating how David's insurance investigation background would influence his response to my apparent death. I needed to leave enough evidence to make my suicide seem genuine without providing so much detail that inconsistencies would become obvious. The goal was to create a scenario that would satisfy both police investigation and insurance company scrutiny while giving me time to establish a new life. The timeline I developed spanned 3 months of preparation. November would be spent gradually establishing the foundation for my new identity while continuing to play the role of David's increasingly unstable wife. December would involve finalizing arrangements and positioning myself for the staged death. January would be the month I actually disappeared,
taking advantage of winter weather conditions that would make a drowning accident more plausible.
Jake, David's 17-year-old son from his previous marriage, presented both an opportunity and a complication. He lived with us every other week and had been witnessing David's campaign to establish my mental instability. But Jake was perceptive and increasingly uncomfortable with his father's behavior. I'd caught him giving me concerned looks that seemed more confused than worried, as if he couldn't reconcile David's claims about my mental state with his own observations of my behavior. One evening, in late November, Jake approached me while I was preparing dinner. David was working late again, which had become his standard Tuesday routine for alleged fraud investigations that I now knew were actually extended dates with Amanda. Jake sat at the kitchen counter, ostensibly doing homework, but clearly wanting to have a conversation about something important. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" Jake's tone was careful, respectful in the way that suggested he'd been thinking about this question for a while. I continued chopping vegetables, trying to appear casual while my heart rate increased. Jake was intelligent and observant, qualities that could either help or completely derail my plans depending on what he'd noticed. "Of course, Jake. What's on your mind?" I kept my voice steady, warm in the way I'd always tried to be with him since he'd become part of our family 3 years earlier. Jake had never had a particularly close relationship with David, who tended to be distant and critical, but Jake and I had developed genuine affection for each other based on shared interests in books, movies, and long conversations about his plans for college. "Dad keeps saying you're going through a really hard time mentally, but you seem pretty normal to me. Like, you're definitely not happy, but you don't seem suicidal or anything." Jake's directness caught me off guard. He'd been paying closer attention to the dynamics in our house than I'd realized, and his assessment of the situation was surprisingly accurate. I set down my knife and turned to face him fully. Jake's expression was serious, concerned in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. He wasn't asking because David had coached him to gather information. He was genuinely confused by the disconnect between his father's claims and his own observations of my behavior. "What makes you think your dad believes I'm having mental health problems?" I asked carefully. Jake was a potential ally, but he was also David's son, and I needed to understand his loyalties and motivations before revealing anything that could complicate my plans. "He talks about it constantly when you're not around. How worried he is, how you've been making concerning comments, how he's afraid you might hurt yourself." Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I live here half the time, and I've never seen you do or say anything that seems suicidal. You seem sad sometimes, and you and Dad obviously aren't getting along great, but that's different from being mentally ill." Jake's ability to distinguish between normal marital unhappiness and clinical depression impressed me. At 17, he had better insight into psychological dynamics than many adults. His observation also confirmed that David's manipulation campaign was primarily directed at external audiences, rather than genuine concern for my well-being. "Have you mentioned your observations to your dad?" I asked. Jake's response would tell me whether he was already challenging David's narrative or simply collecting information for himself. "I tried to once, but he got really defensive. He said I was too young to understand the subtle signs of mental illness, and that just because someone seems okay on the surface doesn't mean they're not struggling internally." Jake rolled his eyes slightly. It felt like he was giving me a lecture from some psychology textbook rather than talking about someone we both live with. This conversation revealed that Jake was not only skeptical of David's claims, but actively questioning them. His intelligence and perception made him a potential asset, but also a significant risk. If Jake suspected I was planning something dramatic, he might try to intervene in ways that could expose my preparations or put himself in danger. "Jake, I appreciate your concern, and I want you to know that I'm not planning to hurt myself," I said, choosing my words very carefully. This was technically true since I was planning to fake my death rather than actually commit suicide. But I am going through some difficult things right now that I can't really discuss with anyone. Jake nodded thoughtfully.
"Is it because of Dad's affair?" The question hit me like a physical blow. If Jake knew about Amanda, then David's attempts to keep his relationship secret had been far less successful than he believed. It also meant Jake had been watching family dynamics with much more sophistication than anyone had realized. "What makes you think your dad is having an affair?" I managed to ask, though my voice probably betrayed my shock at his directness. Tuesday and Thursday late nights that started suddenly, new cologne, different music in his car, taking phone calls in private, plus he's been way too interested in making you seem crazy. Jake's analysis was methodical and accurate. If you were actually mentally ill, he'd be trying to get you help quietly. Instead, he talks about your problems to everyone who will listen. That suggests he wants people to believe you're unstable for some reason that benefits him. The sophistication of Jake's reasoning was both impressive and concerning. He'd independently arrived at many of the same conclusions I'd reached about David's motivations and methods. But his knowledge also meant he was potentially in danger if David realized how much his son had figured out about the affair and manipulation campaign. "Jake, if you're right about these things, then you need to be very careful about what you say to your dad," I warned him. "People who are willing to manipulate others psychologically can become dangerous when they feel cornered or exposed." Jake's expression grew more serious. "Are you afraid of him, Sarah? Like physically afraid?" His questions suggested he'd been wondering about this possibility and was prepared to take protective action if necessary. "I'm not in immediate physical danger," I said carefully, "but your dad has been working very hard to convince everyone that I'm mentally unstable, and that kind of reputation destruction can have serious consequences for someone's life and future." We talked for another 20 minutes before David returned home. Jake's insights into his father's behavior, combined with his obvious concern for my well-being, made me realize that I had an unexpected ally in my plans. But it also complicated everything because involving Jake in any way could put him at risk and would require me to consider his emotional well-being when I eventually disappeared. That night, after David had gone to sleep, I began developing a more sophisticated plan that took Jake's knowledge and perceptions into account. If he already suspected his father of having an affair and manipulating my reputation, then Jake could potentially serve as a witness to David's behavior, both before and after my disappearance. His testimony about David's lack of genuine concern for my mental health could be valuable if questions arose about whether my suicide was actually plausible. But using Jake as an unwitting accomplice felt morally complicated. He cared about me genuinely, and allowing him to believe I'd committed suicide would cause him real emotional trauma. The alternative was bringing him into my confidence, which would make him an active participant in deceiving law enforcement and insurance companies about my death. The ethical dimensions of my plan were becoming increasingly complex as I considered how my disappearance would affect every person in my life. Lisa would blame herself for not recognizing signs of my depression. My parents would spend their remaining years wondering what they could have done differently. My coworkers would question whether they'd missed opportunities to provide support. Even our neighbors would feel guilty about not reaching out when they noticed David talking publicly about my mental health struggles. The weight of causing this much pain to innocent people felt enormous, but I kept returning to the fundamental reality of my situation. David was systematically destroying my psychological well-being while building a public case for why my eventual suicide would be unsurprising. December brought an acceleration of David's manipulation campaign. He started suggesting that I should take a leave of absence from work to focus on my mental health. When I resisted, he framed my reluctance as evidence that I was in denial about the severity of my condition. "Sarah, your supervisor has noticed changes in your performance. Maybe it's time to admit that you need professional help before this affects your career permanently." I hadn't been aware of any performance issues at work, so I scheduled a private meeting with my supervisor to discuss David's claims. Jennifer Reyes was surprised by my questions about whether she'd had concerns about my work quality or emotional state. "Sarah, you've been one of our most reliable employees for the past 4 years. Your work has been consistently excellent, and I haven't noticed any changes in your behavior or performance," Jennifer assured me.
Why are you asking about this? Has someone suggested there are problems I should be aware of? David's claim about workplace concerns turned out to be completely fabricated, another piece of his systematic campaign to convince everyone around me that I was experiencing a mental health crisis that I was too sick to recognize myself. The conversation with Jennifer also revealed that David had never actually spoken to anyone at my workplace about my supposed problems, which meant his reference to supervisor concerns was pure fiction designed to make me doubt my own competence and judgment. This pattern of fabricated evidence extended to other areas of my life. David claimed our family doctor had expressed concerns about my mental state during my last checkup, but when I called Dr. Morrison's office, they had no record of any such conversation. David alleged that our neighbors had asked him about my well-being after noticing concerning behavior, but casual conversations with neighbors revealed they'd never spoken to David about me at all. The realization that David was creating an entirely fictional narrative about my mental health, complete with fabricated supporting evidence from authority figures, was both terrifying and liberating. It confirmed that my perception of reality was accurate and that David's manipulation campaign was even more extensive and calculated than I'd initially understood. But it also provided me with documentation that could potentially be useful if anyone ever questioned the circumstances of my disappearance. By mid-December, I had accumulated enough evidence of David's systematic manipulation to fill a thick folder. Screenshots of his location data showing him at Amanda's apartment during alleged work meetings, records of his fabricated claims about conversations with my doctors, supervisor, and neighbors, documentation of his financial behavior, including evidence that he'd been researching life insurance policies and their payout conditions for suicide claims. The life insurance research was particularly chilling. David had been investigating the specific waiting periods and investigation procedures that insurance companies used to verify suicide claims. He downloaded articles about contested death benefits and had saved bookmarks about how long beneficiaries typically had to wait before receiving payouts when suicide was suspected. This research suggested that David wasn't just hoping I'd commit suicide, he was actively preparing for the financial and legal processes that would follow my death. The level of premeditation involved in his behavior had moved far beyond a simple affair or even ordinary psychological abuse. David was systematically preparing for my death while working to ensure it would appear justified and unsurprising to everyone who knew us. The evidence I'd gathered would be crucial for the next phase of my plan, which involved creating a permanent new identity that would allow me to disappear completely while ensuring that David faced appropriate consequences for his actions. If he wanted to benefit from my death, he was going to discover that reality was far more complicated than his careful planning had anticipated. But first, I needed to stage a convincing suicide that would satisfy both police investigation and insurance company scrutiny while giving me enough time to establish a new life before anyone realized I was still alive. The timeline for this deception was getting shorter, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Everything depended on executing a plan that was complex enough to fool professionals, but simple enough that I could manage it entirely on my own. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter cold that seemed to penetrate everything in Riverside. David had arranged to spend the holiday at Amanda's apartment, claiming he needed space to think about our relationship and couldn't handle the stress of pretending everything was normal for the sake of family traditions. His excuse was perfectly crafted to reinforce the narrative he'd been building about our marriage falling apart due to my deteriorating mental state. "Sarah, I think it would be better for both of us if I stayed elsewhere for a few days," David announced over breakfast, his tone carrying the weight of a man making a difficult but necessary decision. "You've been so unpredictable lately, and the holidays are obviously a trigger for your anxiety. Maybe some time apart will give us both perspective on where we go from here." The performance was masterful. David managed to sound both concerned and exhausted, like a devoted husband who'd reached the end of his ability to cope with his wife's mental illness. He even packed a bag with theatrical reluctance, pausing to look back at me with an expression that conveyed regret and worry in equal measure. "Will you be okay alone?" he asked, and I recognized the question as another piece of evidence he was collecting. If something happened to me while he was conveniently away for the holidays, he'd be able to point to this moment as proof that he'd been concerned about leaving me unsupervised, but had felt he had no choice, given my recent behavior. "I'll be fine, David. I think some quiet time might actually be good for me too," I replied, giving him exactly the response he needed to hear. My calm acceptance of his abandonment would later be presented as evidence that I'd already been planning something drastic and was relieved to have the opportunity to carry it out without interference. Jake was supposed to spend Christmas Eve with his mother, but he stopped by the house that afternoon to pick up some belongings he'd forgotten. When he realized David had already left and I was spending the holiday alone, his expression shifted to genuine concern, mixed with anger at his father's callousness. "He actually left you alone on Christmas Eve?" he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's incredibly selfish, even for him. Do you want to come with me to Mom's house? She wouldn't mind having you for dinner."
The invitation was genuine and kind, but it complicated my timeline in ways I couldn't afford. That's really sweet of you, Jake, but I think I need some quiet time to process everything that's been happening. Sometimes being alone is exactly what you need to gain clarity about your situation. Jake studied my face carefully, and I could see him trying to decode my meaning. He'd become skilled at reading between the lines of adult conversations, particularly when they involved his father's manipulative behavior. "Sarah, you're not planning to do anything dramatic, are you? Because if Dad's behavior has been making you feel desperate, there are better solutions than whatever you might be considering." His directness caught me off guard. Jake had clearly been worried about the possibility that David's psychological campaign might eventually drive me to actual self-harm. The irony was that while David was hoping for exactly that outcome, Jake was genuinely concerned about preventing it. "I'm not going to hurt myself, Jake," I said, which was technically true since my plan involved faking my death rather than actually committing suicide. "But I am planning to make some major changes in my life that will solve the problems I've been dealing with." Jake nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "Just promise me that if you're thinking about doing something permanent, you'll talk to me first. I know I'm just a teenager, but I care about what happens to you, and I don't trust Dad's version of what's been going on in this house." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jake expressing insights about his father's behavior that were both perceptive and concerning. He'd noticed David's increased interest in life insurance policies, his research into suicide statistics, and his casual conversations with neighbors about my supposed mental health struggles. Jake had independently concluded that David was building a case for something, though he wasn't sure exactly what his father was planning. "The thing that bothers me most is how he talks about you when you're not around," Jake confided. "It's not like he's worried and seeking advice about how to help you. It's more like he's preparing people for bad news that he already knows is coming." Jake's observation was chillingly accurate. David wasn't behaving like a husband desperately trying to save his wife from mental illness. He was acting like someone managing public perception ahead of a predictable tragedy. The distinction was subtle, but crucial, and Jake's ability to recognize it demonstrated both his intelligence and his growing awareness of his father's manipulative nature. After Jake left, I spent Christmas Eve finalizing the details of my disappearance plan. The Pine Lake Cabins Resort had confirmed my reservation for a solo retreat starting December 28th. I'd specifically requested a cabin near the water, explaining that I was hoping to find peace and reflection during a difficult time in my life. The reservation staff had been sympathetic and accommodating, offering exactly the kind of isolated location I needed for staging a convincing accident. The logistics of creating a new identity had proven more complex than I had initially anticipated. Elena Parker would need a social security number, credit history, employment background, and residential address that could withstand casual scrutiny. I'd spent weeks researching identity theft protection to understand how people successfully assumed new identities, then worked backward to create documentation that would support my fictional background.
The most challenging aspect was establishing a financial foundation for Elena's life that couldn't be traced back to Sarah Mitchell's assets. I'd gradually been converting cash from my personal account into prepaid credit cards and cryptocurrency wallets that could be accessed from anywhere. The amounts were small enough to avoid triggering reporting requirements, but collectively they would provide several months of living expenses while Elena established legitimate income sources. My research into missing persons cases had revealed that successful disappearances typically involved either moving to locations where the missing person had no previous connections or assuming identities that provided logical explanations for their lack of local history. Elena Parker would be a freelance graphic designer who'd recently moved to Cleveland from Portland to be closer to family, which would explain both her unfamiliarity with local connections and her ability to work remotely. The emotional preparation for permanently abandoning my existing life remained the most difficult part of the entire plan. I'd written letters to Lisa, my parents, and Jake that would be delivered weeks after my disappearance, explaining my decision and apologizing for the pain my staged death would cause them. The letters were carefully crafted to provide some measure of closure while maintaining the fiction that I'd actually committed suicide. Lisa's letter was particularly difficult to write. She'd struggled with depression during college and had always been protective of me as her younger sister. News of my suicide would devastate her and likely trigger feelings of guilt about not recognizing warning signs that never actually existed. But explaining the truth would make her an accessory to insurance fraud and potentially put her in legal jeopardy. The letter to my parents focused on expressing gratitude for their love and support while apologizing for not being strong enough to overcome the challenges I'd been facing. I knew they would blame themselves for my death, wondering what signs they'd missed and what they could have done differently. The guilt they would carry was heartbreaking to contemplate, but the alternative was remaining trapped in a marriage in which my husband was actively working toward my destruction. Jake's letter was the most complex because he already suspected that David's behavior was manipulative and potentially dangerous. I couldn't explain the full truth without making him a co-conspirator, but I wanted to provide enough information to protect him from his father's manipulation while encouraging him to trust his own perceptions about what had been going on in our household.
The final preparations required purchasing supplies for the staged drowning that would make my death appear genuine. Winter clothing that would be found on the shoreline, personal items that would suggest I'd been at the lake for contemplation and had impulsively decided to end my life, and documentation that would support the narrative of a woman who'd been struggling with mental health issues for months. I'd researched drowning accidents extensively to understand how bodies behave in cold water and what evidence investigators typically expected to find at suicide scenes. The key was providing enough detail to make the death appear genuine without creating so much evidence that inconsistencies would become obvious during investigation. Pine Lake's depth and temperature conditions in late December would make recovery of a body unlikely, which was crucial for buying time to establish Elena Parker's life before anyone realized Sarah Mitchell was still alive. Historical data showed that bodies lost in the lake during winter months were rarely recovered, particularly when drowning occurred far from shore in the deepest sections of the water. The weather forecast for the final week of December showed freezing temperatures and snow conditions that would make an accidental drowning more plausible, while also limiting the number of potential witnesses who might be at the resort during my staged suicide. The isolation I needed for disappearing safely would be provided naturally by weather conditions that kept most people indoors. David's behavior during the days leading up to my planned disappearance had become increasingly transparent to anyone who was paying attention. His expressions of concern about leaving me alone were clearly performative, designed to establish his caring husband credentials for anyone who might later question his actions. But his underlying excitement about the holiday separation was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. On December 27th, the day before my departure for Pine Lake Cabins, David returned home to collect more clothing and check on my emotional state.
His visit was brief and obviously calculated to gather final intelligence about my mental condition that he could later report to investigators as evidence of my deteriorating state of mind. "Sarah, you look terrible," he announced within minutes of walking through the door. "Have you been eating? Sleeping? You seem like you're barely holding yourself together." His assessment was delivered with practiced concern, but I recognized it as an attempt to document my supposedly declining condition for later reference. "I've been having a difficult time with everything that's happening between us," I replied, giving him exactly the kind of response he needed to hear. "I keep thinking about how different my life might have been if I'd made better choices along the way." David's reaction was immediate and satisfied. "Sarah, that kind of thinking is exactly why I've been so worried about you. When people start focusing on regrets and alternative life paths, it suggests they're considering permanent solutions to temporary problems." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with David skillfully eliciting responses that could later be interpreted as suicide ideation, while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivations for the questioning. He asked about my plans for the coming week, my feelings about our marriage, and my thoughts about whether some problems were too difficult to solve through conventional means. By the end of his visit, David had collected enough material to construct a compelling narrative about a woman who'd been contemplating suicide and had finally reached the point where she was ready to act on those thoughts. His performance as a concerned husband gathering information was masterful, but his underlying satisfaction with my responses was visible to anyone who knew his true motivations. "I think I should stay home tonight," David announced, as if the idea had just occurred to him. "You seem like you're in crisis, and it wouldn't be responsible for me to leave you alone when you're obviously struggling so badly." This unexpected change in his plans threatened to derail my entire timeline. If David insisted on staying home, I'd lose the opportunity to disappear during the window I'd carefully planned, and delaying would mean starting over with new reservations, different weather conditions, and potentially compromised operational security. "David, I appreciate your concern, but honestly, I think I need space to process everything without feeling like I'm being watched or managed. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone in crisis is give them room to work through their feelings independently." David's expression showed him weighing his options. Staying home would prevent me from carrying out any suicidal plans, but it would also require him to cancel his arrangements with Amanda and miss an opportunity to gather additional evidence about my mental state. He was clearly torn between his desire to control the situation and his preference for spending time with his mistress. "Are you sure you'll be okay alone?" he asked, framing his decision to leave as reluctant acceptance of my wishes rather than his actual preference. "Because if anything happened to you while I was away, I'd never forgive myself for not staying when you clearly needed support." This statement was perfectly crafted to serve as evidence of his caring nature if anyone later questioned why he left his suicidal wife alone during a mental health crisis. David was creating documentation of his own responsible behavior while ensuring he had an alibi for whatever happened during his absence. "I think I might drive up to Pine Lake Cabins for a few days to clear my head. Sometimes getting away from familiar surroundings helps you gain perspective on complicated situations." David's reaction to this announcement was exactly what I'd expected. His eyes lit up with barely concealed excitement, though he quickly masked his enthusiasm with expressions of concern about me traveling alone in my current emotional state. The suggestion that I was planning to go to an isolated location during a mental health crisis was exactly the kind of detail he'd been hoping to collect. "Sarah, I'm not sure that's a good idea."
Being alone in a remote location when you're feeling this way could be dangerous. What if something happened and there was no one around to help you? His objections were perfectly reasonable and would later serve as evidence that he tried to prevent me from making a reckless decision. "I think being surrounded by nature and having quiet time to reflect is exactly what I need right now," I insisted, providing him with additional material for his eventual narrative about my final days. "I've already made a reservation, and honestly, the idea of getting away from everything feels like the first positive step I've considered in months."
David continued to express reservations while clearly being thrilled that I was voluntarily placing myself in an isolated location where an accident or suicide would be both plausible and difficult to investigate thoroughly. His performance as a reluctant husband allowing his unstable wife to make a potentially dangerous decision was convincing enough to provide him with perfect cover for whatever happened during my absence. The final conversation between Sarah Mitchell and her husband lasted another 30 minutes, with David collecting additional details about my travel plans, emotional state, and thoughts about our future together. By the time he left, he had everything he needed to construct a compelling story about a woman who'd been planning suicide and had finally found the perfect opportunity to carry out her plans without interference. What David didn't realize was that every word of our conversation had been recorded, providing documentation of his manipulative questioning and barely concealed excitement about my planned isolation. The recording would be crucial evidence if anyone ever needed to understand the true dynamics of our relationship and David's role in creating the circumstances that led to my disappearance. The night before my departure for Pine Lake Cabins, I completed the final preparations for becoming Elena Parker permanently. Sarah Mitchell's life would end the next day, but Elena's life was already beginning, with apartment applications submitted, freelance design portfolios created, and social media profiles established with enough history to appear authentic. The transformation from victim to survivor was almost complete. In less than 24 hours, David would discover that manipulating someone to the point of desperation can produce unexpected results when the victim is intelligent enough to turn the situation to their advantage. He'd wanted me to disappear, and he was going to get exactly what he'd been hoping for, just not in the way he'd anticipated. The drive to Pine Lake Cabins on December 28th felt like traveling toward my own rebirth. Every mile that separated me from Riverside brought a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in months. The winter landscape was stark and beautiful, with snow-covered fields stretching endlessly under a gray sky that perfectly matched my emotional state. This would be the last day Sarah Mitchell existed, and tomorrow, Elena Parker would begin building a life free from David's manipulation and psychological warfare. The resort was exactly as isolated as I'd hoped. The main lodge sat on a hill overlooking the frozen lake, surrounded by individual cabins scattered among tall pine trees. Most of the cabins appeared empty, with no cars in their driveways or lights in their windows. The few other guests I glimpsed seemed to be couples seeking winter solitude, exactly the kind of people who would mind their own business and provide minimal interference with my plans. Cabin 7 was positioned perfectly for my purposes, with direct access to the lake through a wooded path and enough distance from neighboring cabins to ensure privacy during the critical hours when I would stage my disappearance. The interior was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, small kitchen, and large windows facing the water. Under different circumstances, it would have been the perfect place for genuine reflection and healing. I spent the afternoon establishing my presence at the resort in ways that would later support the narrative of a woman struggling with suicidal thoughts. I visited the main lodge twice, making casual conversation with staff members about feeling overwhelmed by personal problems and hoping that time in nature would provide clarity about my future. The conversations were carefully crafted to plant seeds that would bloom into evidence when investigators later tried to reconstruct my final days. The resort manager, a kind woman named Carol Henderson, was particularly receptive to my subtle cues about emotional distress. When I mentioned feeling lost and uncertain about whether my problems had solutions, she offered exactly the kind of supportive response I needed her to remember later. Sometimes when life feels overwhelming, being surrounded by natural beauty can help put things in perspective, Carol told me. The lake has a way of making people feel peaceful, like their troubles aren't as insurmountable as they seemed before. I agreed with her assessment while adding carefully chosen details about my situation that would later be interpreted as warning signs. I keep thinking about how different my life could have been if I'd made better choices. Sometimes I wonder if it's too late to start over, or if some mistakes are just too big to recover from.
Carol's concern was genuine and immediate. It's never too late to make positive changes in your life. Whatever's been troubling you, there are always alternatives to giving up completely. Have you considered talking to a counselor or therapist about what you're going through? The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with me carefully building a picture of a woman on the edge of despair, while Carol tried to provide encouragement and resources. By the end of our talk, I'd successfully established myself as someone who was contemplating drastic solutions to overwhelming problems, exactly the impression I needed her to carry when investigators later asked about my mental state. That evening, I made my final preparations for the staged drowning that would end Sarah Mitchell's existence. The plan required precise timing and careful attention to physical evidence that would support the suicide narrative while giving me enough time to reach Cleveland and begin establishing Elena Parker's life before anyone realized what had actually happened. The weather conditions were perfect for my purposes. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below freezing, with snow falling steadily and wind creating dangerous conditions on the lake. These were exactly the circumstances that would make an impulsive suicide attempt both plausible and likely to be fatal, while also ensuring that any search and rescue efforts would be delayed and limited in scope.
I laid out the clothing and personal items that would be found on the shoreline as evidence of my final moments. My winter coat, boots, and scarf would be discovered partially buried in snow near the water's edge, along with my purse containing identification, credit cards, and a handwritten note expressing despair about my marriage and future prospects. The note was carefully worded to sound genuinely suicidal while avoiding specific details that might create inconsistencies during investigation. The most challenging part of the staging process was creating convincing evidence that I'd actually entered the water without leaving traces that would reveal the deception. I used a small inflatable raft to reach the center of the lake, where I deployed a weighted dummy dressed in my clothing that would sink into the deep water and potentially be discovered weeks or months later as additional confirmation of my death. The dummy was constructed using materials that would decompose naturally over time, ensuring that if it was ever found, it would appear to be remains that had been submerged for an extended period. The clothing contained DNA evidence from hair and skin cells that would provide positive identification, while the weighted materials would keep the evidence at the bottom of the lake until spring conditions potentially brought it to the surface. After positioning the dummy in the deepest part of the lake, I returned to shore and carefully arranged the scene that would be discovered the next morning. My personal items were scattered in a pattern consistent with someone who had removed their outer clothing before entering the water, while footprints in the snow led from the cabin directly to the water's edge with no returning tracks. The final element of the staging process involved creating a timeline that would give me maximum time to reach Cleveland and establish Elena Parker's presence there before anyone realized Sarah Mitchell was missing. I left lights on in the cabin and set timers that would create the appearance of normal activity for several hours after my actual departure, buying crucial time for my escape. The drive from Pine Lake to Cleveland took place in the early hours of December 29th, with snow falling heavily enough to provide additional cover for my movements, while creating hazardous conditions that would discourage immediate search efforts when my absence was eventually discovered. The route I'd chosen avoided major highways and traffic cameras, using back roads that were less likely to have surveillance systems that could later trace my movements. Elena Parker's apartment in Lakewood had been prepared weeks in advance, with utilities connected, furniture delivered, and enough personal belongings installed to create the appearance of someone who'd been living there for several weeks. The lease was signed using documentation I'd carefully created, including references that would withstand casual verification, but wouldn't hold up under intensive investigation. The transformation from Sarah to Elena required more than just assuming a new name and address. I'd spent months studying Elena's fictional background until I could embody her completely, understanding her supposed history, personality, and motivations well enough to maintain the deception indefinitely. Elena was more confident than Sarah, more independent, and much less willing to tolerate manipulation or abuse from anyone. The first week of Elena's life was spent establishing routines and connections that would support her long-term existence in Cleveland.
I opened bank accounts using my new identity, applied for freelance graphic design projects, and began building social connections with neighbors and local business owners. Every interaction was carefully managed to create the impression of someone who'd recently moved to the area but was already integrating successfully into the community. Meanwhile, the discovery of Sarah Mitchell's apparent suicide was unfolding exactly as I'd planned. Carol Henderson found my abandoned belongings on the morning of December 29th and immediately contacted local authorities. The scene was processed by investigators who concluded that a distraught woman had impulsively decided to end her life by drowning in the frigid lake waters. David's reaction to news of my death was a masterclass in performative grief. He rushed to Pine Lake Cabins with tears in his eyes and expressions of shock that convinced everyone he encountered that he was a devastated husband who'd lost his wife to mental illness despite his best efforts to provide support. His ability to cry on command and deliver heartbroken statements to investigators was impressive and deeply disturbing. I knew Sarah was struggling, but I never thought she'd actually go through with something like this, David told investigators, his voice breaking with apparent emotion. I tried to get her help, but she kept insisting she was fine and didn't need therapy. I should have pushed harder, should have stayed with her instead of giving her the space she said she needed. The guilt and self-recrimination David expressed were perfectly calibrated to deflect suspicion while establishing his credentials as a caring husband who'd done everything possible to prevent my wife's suicide. Investigators found his emotional responses completely believable and never questioned whether his grief might be fabricated. Jake's reaction to news of my death was the most difficult part of the entire deception to witness from afar. His genuine devastation and confusion about how he'd missed signs of my suicidal intentions broke my heart in ways I hadn't anticipated. The letters I'd written wouldn't be delivered for several more weeks, leaving Jake to struggle with feelings of guilt and responsibility that he didn't deserve. I lived in that house half the time, Jake told investigators through tears. How could I not have known she was planning this? She seemed sad about the marriage problems, but she never seemed hopeless. I don't understand how I missed something this serious. Jake's inability to reconcile his observations of my behavior with the apparent reality of my suicide created exactly the kind of cognitive dissonance I'd hoped to achieve. His confusion would eventually lead him to question his father's version of events, particularly as he learned more about David's relationship with Amanda and the timing of their affair. The insurance investigation proceeded exactly as I'd anticipated. David filed a claim for the life insurance policy within days of my death, expressing reluctance about pursuing financial benefits so soon after my wife's suicide, but explaining that he needed the money to pay for funeral expenses and outstanding debts. His apparent discomfort about discussing money during his time of grief was another convincing performance that deflected suspicion about his motivations. The insurance company's investigation was thorough, but ultimately concluded that Sarah Mitchell had committed suicide after struggling with mental health issues for several months. The evidence at Pine Lake Cabins supported the suicide determination, while interviews with David, resort staff, and family members all confirmed that I'd been showing signs of depression and emotional instability leading up to my death. Amanda Rodriguez played her role perfectly as the sympathetic colleague who had been providing David with emotional support during his wife's mental health crisis. Her testimony to investigators portrayed her as someone who had been genuinely concerned about my well-being and had encouraged David to seek professional help for both of us.
The fact that she and David had been having an affair never came to light during the investigation. David was so worried about Sarah's mental state, Amanda told investigators with apparent sincerity. He would come to work exhausted from dealing with her mood swings and concerning comments about death. I kept telling him he needed to get her professional help, but she was resistant to therapy and became angry whenever he suggested it. The timeline Amanda provided matched David's narrative perfectly, creating a cohesive story about a marriage strained by one partner's deteriorating mental health and the other partner's desperate attempts to provide support. Neither of them mentioned their romantic relationship, which would have complicated the narrative and raised questions about their motivations for portraying me as unstable.
3 weeks after my staged death, the letters I'd written were delivered to Lisa, my parents, and Jake through a service I'd arranged in advance. The timing was calculated to provide some closure while maintaining the fiction that I'd actually committed suicide, though Jake's letter contained subtle clues that might eventually lead him to question the official version of events. Lisa's reaction to my letter was devastating to learn about through news reports and social media posts. She blamed herself for not recognizing signs of my depression and spent weeks analyzing our recent conversations for warning signals she might have missed. The guilt she experienced was heartbreaking, but explaining the truth would have made her an accessory to insurance fraud and potentially destroyed the new life I was building. My parents' response was equally painful to witness from afar. They released a statement through local media expressing their shock at my suicide and their regret that they hadn't been able to provide the support I apparently needed. The statement included appeals for better mental health resources and increased awareness of suicide warning signs, turning their grief into advocacy that honored the fictional version of my death. Jake's reaction to his letter was more complex and ultimately more dangerous to my deception. The subtle clues I'd included about David's manipulative behavior prompted him to start questioning his father's version of events leading up to my death. Jake began researching the timeline of David's affair with Amanda and comparing it to the alleged progression of my mental health decline. "Something doesn't add up about this whole situation," Jake confided to a friend whose mother later shared the comment with investigators. "Sarah seemed sad about the marriage, but she didn't seem hopeless, and Dad's story about trying to help her doesn't match what I actually saw happening in our house." Jake's growing suspicions represented a potential threat to both David's narrative and my own safety. If he pushed his investigation too far, he might uncover evidence that would expose David's manipulation campaign, but he could also potentially discover clues that would lead to Elena Parker and reveal that I was still alive. The 6th month of Elena Parker's life brought news that David and Amanda had married in a quiet ceremony, with David explaining that they'd found comfort in each other during the grieving process and had decided to build a new life together. The timeline was suspiciously quick for a widower to remarry, but most people attributed it to different grieving processes and the human need for companionship during difficult times. Jake refused to attend the wedding and became increasingly vocal about his suspicions regarding his father's behavior before and after my death. His questions attracted the attention of a private investigator named Marcus Chen, who specialized in insurance fraud cases and had been monitoring the David Mitchell claim due to some inconsistencies that had emerged during the routine investigation. Marcus Chen's involvement represented a significant escalation in the complexity of my situation. If he uncovered evidence that my suicide was staged, it would not only expose David's manipulative behavior, but also reveal that I was still alive and had committed multiple felonies in the process of faking my death. The investigation could potentially uncover Elena Parker's identity and destroy the new life I'd worked so hard to establish. The breakthrough in Marcus Chen's investigation came when he analyzed the financial records surrounding David's insurance claim and discovered the research David had been conducting into suicide waiting periods and payout procedures. The premeditation suggested by this research, combined with the quick timeline of David's remarriage, prompted more intensive scrutiny of the circumstances surrounding my death. Jake's testimony to Marcus Chen provided crucial insight into the dynamics of our household during the months leading up to my disappearance. His detailed observations about David's manipulation campaign, combined with his perceptions about my actual mental state, created a picture that contradicted the official narrative about a woman driven to suicide by depression. Sarah wasn't suicidal, Jake insisted during his interview with Marcus Chen. She was trapped in a marriage with someone who was systematically destroying her reputation and psychological well-being. My father wanted her gone, and he got exactly what he was hoping for. The investigation expanded to include analysis of David's phone records, which showed the extent of his communication with Amanda during the period when he was supposedly focused on helping his suicidal wife. The pattern of calls and text messages showed a romantic relationship that had been developing for months. directly contradicting their claims about finding comfort in each other after my death. More damaging was the discovery of David's internet search history, which showed extensive research into life insurance policies, suicide investigation procedures, and financial benefits available to surviving spouses. The premeditation suggested by this research transformed the case from a straightforward suicide into a potential insurance fraud investigation. The confrontation between Marcus Chen and David took place on a cold February morning at David's office. Marcus presented evidence of the manipulation campaign, the timeline of the affair with Amanda, and the financial research that suggested David had been preparing for my death weeks before it occurred. Mr. Mitchell, the evidence suggests that your wife's suicide was not the spontaneous act of a mentally ill woman, but rather the predictable result of systematic psychological abuse designed to drive her to self-destruction. Your behavior before and after her death indicate that you may have been hoping for exactly this outcome, Marcus Chen explained during the recorded interview. David's response was a masterclass in deflection and denial. He expressed shock at the accusations, insisted that his research into suicide was motivated by genuine concern for my well-being, and claimed that his relationship with Amanda had developed naturally during their shared grief over my death. His ability to maintain innocence while confronted with overwhelming evidence of his manipulation was impressive and infuriating.
I loved my wife and did everything I could to help her through her mental health crisis, David insisted. The fact that Amanda and I found comfort in each other after Sarah's death doesn't change the reality that Sarah chose to end her life, despite my best efforts to support her. The insurance company ultimately denied David's claim based on Marcus Chen's investigation, though no criminal charges were filed due to insufficient evidence that David had directly caused my death. The decision cost David the financial benefits he'd been anticipating and left him facing significant legal fees while trying to establish his new marriage under a cloud of suspicion. Jake's vindication in having his suspicions confirmed was tempered by the reality that justice for his stepmother remained incomplete. David had escaped criminal consequences for his psychological abuse campaign, while Amanda continued working as a nurse despite her role in the manipulation scheme. The system had failed to hold either of them fully accountable for their actions. Meanwhile, Alana Parker had successfully established herself as a thriving graphic designer in Cleveland, with a growing client base and an active social life that provided the connections and stability Sarah Mitchell had never been able to achieve. The transformation was complete in every meaningful way, though the emotional cost of abandoning everyone I'd cared about remained a constant source of pain. The year anniversary of Sarah Mitchell's death passed quietly, with David and Amanda posting social media tributes to my memory that were carefully crafted to maintain their narrative about a troubled woman who'd been lost to mental illness. Their public expressions of grief and loss were convincing enough to satisfy most observers, though Jake's continued skepticism meant that questions about the true circumstances of my death would never be completely laid to rest. Alana Parker attended a grief counseling group in Cleveland that February, explaining to the therapist and other participants that she was struggling to process the sudden death of her sister Sarah, who had committed suicide the previous winter. The irony of grieving my own fictional death while living under an assumed identity was surreal, but it provided a socially acceptable way to process the genuine losses involved in disappearing completely. The counseling sessions helped me understand that while I'd escaped David's psychological abuse and built a new life free from manipulation, the cost of that freedom included permanent separation from everyone I genuinely cared about. The grief I experienced for my lost relationships was real, even though my death was fictional. 2 years after my disappearance, Jake graduated from high school and moved to Portland to attend college, deliberately choosing a location that would provide distance from his father and Amanda. Before leaving Ohio, he sent a letter to the Pine Lake Cabins Resort asking them to place flowers on the shoreline where Sarah Mitchell's belongings had been found. "I know she's not really buried anywhere, since her body was never recovered,"
Jake wrote in his letter to Carol Henderson. But that's the last place where she was definitely alive, so it feels like the right place to honor her memory. Jake's gesture was reported in the local newspaper, along with his comments about never accepting that Sarah Mitchell had been suicidal despite the official determination of her death. His continued advocacy for my memory was both touching and concerning, since his persistent questions kept alive the possibility that someone might eventually uncover the truth about my staged death. Elena Parker read about Jake's tribute in an online news article and felt a profound mixture of pride and sadness about the young man who'd become her most effective advocate. His refusal to accept the official narrative about my death ensured that David and Amanda would never be completely free from suspicion, even if they'd escaped criminal prosecution. The success of Elena Parker's new life was measured not just by professional achievements and financial stability, but by the absence of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse that had characterized the final years of Sarah Mitchell's marriage. Elena was free to make decisions without second-guessing her own judgment, to trust her perceptions without fear that they were being systematically distorted, and to build relationships based on honesty rather than survival. The choice to disappear completely rather than simply divorcing David had been vindicated by Marcus Chen's investigation, which revealed the extent of David's manipulation campaign and his genuine anticipation of my death as a solution to his relationship problems. A conventional divorce would have left me vulnerable to continued psychological warfare and potentially ongoing physical danger from someone who'd already demonstrated his willingness to destroy my mental health for personal gain. 3 years after my staged death, Elena Parker had built exactly the kind of life Sarah Mitchell had dreamed of, but never been able to achieve. Professional success, genuine friendships, financial independence, and most importantly, freedom from the constant fear and manipulation that had defined my marriage to David. The price of that freedom was permanent separation from everyone I'd loved, but the alternative had been remaining trapped in a relationship designed to destroy me. David and Amanda's marriage began showing signs of strain in its 3rd year, with social media posts becoming less frequent and public appearances together declining noticeably. The stress of living under suspicion, combined with the financial losses from the denied insurance claim, had apparently taken a toll on their relationship. Jake reported to friends that his father seemed increasingly paranoid and controlling in his new marriage, suggesting that Amanda was beginning to experience some of the same manipulation tactics David had used against me. The irony of David's new relationship developing the same toxic patterns was satisfying, but not surprising. People who are willing to systematically abuse one partner rarely change their behavior simply by changing partners. Amanda helped David destroy my mental health, but she was now discovering what it felt like to be on the receiving end of his manipulation. Elena Parker celebrated her 4th anniversary as a free woman by establishing a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women escape psychologically abusive relationships. The work provided a way to transform my personal experience into something that could protect other people from the kind of systematic destruction David had attempted to inflict on me. The nonprofit's mission focused on education about psychological manipulation tactics, resources for documenting abuse that leaves no physical evidence, and support for women who needed to disappear from dangerous relationships. Elena Parker's background as someone who'd successfully escaped an abusive marriage made her an effective advocate, even though the full truth about her methods could never be shared publicly. Sarah Mitchell had died on December 28th, but Elena Parker was living proof that sometimes the only way to survive psychological warfare is to disappear completely and start over with a new identity. The strategy was extreme and carried significant legal risks, but it had provided freedom that no other approach could have achieved. David Mitchell had gotten exactly what he'd been hoping for when he told Amanda that his suicidal wife had finally done what she'd been threatening to do. Sarah was gone forever, and he was free to build a new life without the complications of divorce proceedings or ongoing contact with someone who knew the truth about his manipulative nature. The woman who once practiced her own eulogy in the bathroom mirror had discovered that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed by people who are hoping for your destruction. Elena Parker was living proof that victims can become survivors, and survivors can build exactly the kind of life their abusers tried to prevent them from having. 5 years after Sarah Mitchell's death, Elena Parker received an unexpected phone call that would forever change the careful balance she'd maintained between her past and present.
The caller identified himself as Detective Robert Hayes from the Riverside Police Department, and his words sent ice through her veins, despite the warm June morning in Cleveland. Miss Parker, I'm calling because your name has come up in connection with an ongoing investigation into the death of Sarah Mitchell. We understand you may have information relevant to our case. Elena's carefully constructed world seemed to tilt on its axis. For 5 years, she'd lived with a constant awareness that her deception could be discovered, but the reality of law enforcement actively seeking her out was more terrifying than any scenario she'd imagined. Her mind raced through possible explanations for how Elena Parker's name could have surfaced in connection with Sarah Mitchell's case. I'm sorry, Detective, but I don't understand. Who is Sarah Mitchell, and why would you think I have information about her? Elena managed to keep her voice steady, drawing on years of practice at maintaining her fictional identity under pressure. Detective Hayes explained that they were conducting a cold case review of suspicious deaths from the past decade, and Sarah Mitchell's apparent suicide had been flagged for reinvestigation due to new evidence that had come to light. Elena listened with growing dread as he described findings that could potentially unravel everything she'd built. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Jake Mitchell, now 22 and working as a computer programmer in Portland, had never stopped investigating his stepmother's death. His technical skills had advanced considerably since high school, and he'd been using sophisticated data analysis tools to examine the digital footprints surrounding Sarah's disappearance. Jake had discovered that someone matching Sarah's profile had been researching identity theft protection and disappearance techniques in the months before her death. More damaging, he'd found evidence that financial transfers had occurred from Sarah's accounts to cryptocurrency wallets that were later accessed from Cleveland area IP addresses. The pattern suggested that Sarah might have been planning to disappear rather than commit suicide. We're not suggesting any wrongdoing on your part, Miss Parker, Detective Hayes continued, but we have reason to believe that Sarah Mitchell may have used resources or contacts in the Cleveland area to establish a new identity. Any information you might have about services that help people disappear or individuals who might have assisted someone in faking their death could be crucial to our investigation. Elena realized that her name had probably surfaced through routine database searches for people who'd moved to Cleveland around the time of Sarah's death, or through analysis of financial networks that might connect to the cryptocurrency transactions Jake had discovered. The investigators weren't targeting her specifically, but they were getting dangerously close to uncovering the truth. Detective, I moved to Cleveland about 5 years ago to be closer to family, but I don't have any knowledge about people faking their deaths or establishing false identities. That sounds like something from a movie rather than real life. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Detective Hayes asking general questions about Elena's background and whether she'd ever encountered anyone who seemed to be living under an assumed identity. Elena provided vague but cooperative responses while mentally calculating how quickly she could disappear again if the investigation focused more specifically on her activities. After ending the call, Elena spent the rest of the day researching the current status of the Sarah Mitchell case and trying to understand how much danger she was actually facing. News articles revealed that the reinvestigation had been prompted by a combination of Jake's independent research and new forensic techniques that had been applied to evidence from the original scene. The most concerning development was that investigators had apparently found inconsistencies in the physical evidence at Pine Lake Cabins that suggested the suicide scene might have been staged. Advanced analysis of the footprint patterns, clothing distribution, and other forensic details had raised questions about whether Sarah had actually entered the water or had simply arranged her belongings to create that impression. Elena's carefully planned deception was being undermined by forensic advances that hadn't existed 5 years earlier.
Technologies that could detect microscopic DNA traces, analyze fabric evidence with unprecedented precision, and reconstruct crime scenes using digital modeling were revealing flaws in staging that would have been undetectable during the original investigation. The renewed scrutiny also meant that David's behavior before and after Sarah's death was being examined more intensively. Investigators had apparently interviewed Amanda about the timeline of their relationship with David, and inconsistencies in their stories had raised additional suspicions about whether Sarah's suicide was actually the result of a murder plot rather than a staged disappearance. This development created a complex situation for Elena. If investigators concluded that David had murdered Sarah rather than driven her to suicide, it would remove suspicion from the staged disappearance theory, but it would also mean that an innocent person was being investigated for murder. Elena's moral obligation to prevent David from being wrongly convicted of murder conflicted with her need to protect her own freedom and safety. The ethical dilemma was further complicated by the fact that David wasn't entirely innocent. His systematic psychological abuse campaign had been designed to drive Sarah to suicide, and he'd expressed satisfaction when he believed that goal had been achieved. While he hadn't actually committed murder, his actions had been intended to cause Sarah's death through psychological manipulation rather than physical violence.
If convicted, David could face life in prison for a crime he hadn't technically committed. Jake's reaction to his father's arrest was reported extensively in local media. He expressed satisfaction that David was finally facing consequences for his treatment of Sarah, but also confusion about why investigators believed David had killed her rather than driven her to suicide through psychological abuse. "I always knew my father was responsible for Sarah's death, but I thought it was because he manipulated her into killing herself," Jake told reporters. The idea that he actually murdered her is almost harder to believe than the suicide story, because it would have required planning and execution that doesn't match his usual methods of hurting people. Jake's statement suggested that he still suspected Sarah might have staged her disappearance rather than committed suicide or been murdered. His continued investigation into digital evidence and financial patterns meant that he was potentially close to discovering Elena Parker's true identity, which would expose both the staged death and David's innocence of murder charges. The pressure to act became overwhelming when Elena learned that David's trial was scheduled to begin within 6 months. The prosecution's case was built on the assumption that Sarah was dead and that David had killed her for financial gain. Without Sarah's body or direct evidence of murder, the case relied heavily on establishing David's motive and opportunity to commit the crime. Elena realized that her survival was the only evidence that could definitively prove David's innocence of murder, while also exposing the true extent of his psychological abuse campaign. Revealing herself would save David from wrongful conviction while ensuring that he faced appropriate consequences for the manipulation tactics that had driven her to such desperate measures. The decision to resurface was the most difficult choice Elena had ever made. She'd built a successful life as Elena Parker, with meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the kind of psychological freedom that Sarah Mitchell had never experienced. Returning to her original identity meant giving up everything she'd gained and facing serious criminal charges for the deception she'd maintained for 5 years. But allowing an innocent person to be convicted of murder, even someone as morally culpable as David, was something Elena couldn't live with. Her sense of justice demanded that she take responsibility for her actions and ensure that David faced consequences that matched his actual crimes rather than fictional ones. The revelation that Sarah Mitchell was alive required careful orchestration to minimize legal consequences while maximizing the impact on David's case. Elena contacted a criminal defense attorney in Cleveland who specialized in complex fraud cases and explained her situation in general terms, seeking advice about how to resurface without facing maximum penalties for her deception. The attorney, Margaret Foster, was fascinated by the complexity of Elena's case and the ethical implications of someone faking their death to escape psychological abuse. She explained that, while Elena would likely face charges for insurance fraud and identity theft, her cooperation in exposing the truth about David's manipulation campaign could result in reduced sentences or alternative penalties.
The fact that you're voluntarily coming forward to prevent a wrongful murder conviction will carry significant weight with prosecutors, Margaret explained. Your case is also unique because the alleged victim is revealing herself to be alive, which fundamentally changes the nature of all related charges. Margaret helped Elena develop a strategy for resurfacing that would provide maximum protection while ensuring that the truth about David's psychological abuse campaign was fully documented. The plan involved contacting Detective Hayes directly, providing comprehensive evidence of David's manipulation tactics, and cooperating fully with the investigation in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The phone call to Detective Hayes was surreal in ways Elena hadn't anticipated. Identifying herself as Sarah Mitchell, after 5 years of being legally dead, felt like confessing to a crime while simultaneously proving innocence of a different crime. Detective Hayes, this is Sarah Mitchell calling. I understand you've been investigating my death, and I need to tell you that the reports of my suicide were greatly exaggerated. The silence on Detective Hayes' end lasted nearly 30 seconds before he managed to respond. Ms. Mitchell, if this is really you, then we need to meet immediately. There are some very serious charges pending that depend on whether you're actually alive or dead. The meeting took place at the Riverside Police Department 3 days later, with Elena accompanied by Margaret Foster and facing a room full of investigators who'd been working on various aspects of her case for months. The surreal nature of explaining her own staged death to people who'd been trying to solve her murder created an atmosphere that was both tense and absurd. Elena's detailed account of David's psychological abuse campaign, supported by the evidence she'd collected before disappearing, provided investigators with a completely different understanding of the dynamics that had led to her death. The manipulation documented anticipation of her suicide painted a picture of psychological warfare rather than murder. Mr. Mitchell was hoping I would commit suicide, but he wasn't planning to kill me directly, Alana explained to the stunned investigators. He was conducting a campaign of psychological abuse designed to drive me to self-destruction while providing him with plausible deniability about his role in my death. The evidence Alana provided included recordings of David's conversations with Amanda about hoping for her death, documentation of his fabricated claims about her mental health, and proof of his research into life insurance policies and suicide investigation procedures. The material demonstrated premeditation and intent, but for psychological manipulation rather than physical murder. Detective Hayes and his team spent hours reviewing Alana's evidence and trying to understand how they'd misinterpreted the case so fundamentally. The staged suicide had been so convincing that they never seriously considered the possibility that Sarah was still alive, and the circumstantial evidence pointing to David as a murderer had seemed to confirm their assumptions about what had happened. Mr. Mitchell was definitely planning something involving your death, but it appears he was hoping you'd do it yourself rather than planning to kill you directly, Detective Hayes summarized after reviewing the evidence. The question now is what charges are appropriate for his actual crimes versus the murder charges we've already filed. The legal complexities of Elena's reappearance extended far beyond David's case.
She faced potential charges for insurance fraud, identity theft, filing false reports, and numerous other crimes related to her 5-year deception. The financial institutions, government agencies, and insurance companies that had been affected by her staged death all had legitimate claims for restitution and justice. However, Elena's status as a victim of systematic psychological abuse provided mitigating circumstances that complicated the prosecution's approach to her case. Margaret Foster argued that Elena's crimes had been committed as a direct result of David's manipulation campaign and represented a form of self-defense against psychological warfare that could have ultimately resulted in actual suicide. My client was facing a choice between staging her death or potentially being driven to actual suicide by ongoing psychological abuse, Margaret explained to prosecutors. The deception she chose was illegal, but it was also a survival strategy that allowed her to escape a situation that was genuinely life-threatening to her mental health. The prosecution's response was mixed. While they acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of Elena's situation, they also emphasized that her deception had wasted significant law enforcement resources and had nearly resulted in an innocent person being convicted of murder. The balance between accountability and understanding required careful consideration of precedent and justice.
David's reaction to learning that Sarah was alive was reportedly one of shock followed by rage. According to his attorney, David felt betrayed by Sarah's deception and insisted that her staged death proved she'd been as manipulative and unstable as he'd always claimed. His inability to accept responsibility for the psychological abuse that had driven her to such extreme measures was consistent with his pattern of blaming others for problems he'd created. Amanda's response was more complex. She reportedly expressed relief that David wasn't actually a murderer, but also horror at realizing she'd been an accessory to a psychological abuse campaign that had driven someone to fake their own death. Her cooperation with investigators suggested that she was beginning to understand the true nature of her relationship with David and her role in destroying Sarah's mental health. Jake's reaction to learning that Sarah was alive was pure joy mixed with vindication. His years of investigation and refusal to accept the official story had been proven correct, and the stepmother he'd cared about was safe and free from his father's manipulation. His public statement about Sarah's reappearance was emotional and supportive. "I always knew something wasn't right about the suicide story, and I'm incredibly relieved to learn that Sarah is alive and well," Jake announced through his attorney. "Her decision to disappear was extreme, but given what I witnessed of my father's psychological abuse, I understand why she felt it was her only option for survival." Jake's continued advocacy for Sarah, even after learning about her deception, provided crucial support during the legal proceedings that followed her reappearance. His testimony about David's manipulation tactics and his observations of the household dynamics before Sarah's disappearance helped establish the context that had driven her to such desperate measures. The media coverage of Sarah's reappearance was intense and largely sympathetic. Her story became a case study in psychological abuse and the extreme measures that victims sometimes take to escape manipulative relationships. Mental health advocates used her case to highlight the serious consequences of emotional abuse and the need for better recognition of psychological manipulation as a form of domestic violence. The legal resolution of Elena's case took nearly 18 months to complete. She ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges related to insurance fraud and identity theft, receiving a sentence of 3 years probation and community service focused on helping other victims of domestic abuse. The court acknowledged that her crimes had been committed as a survival response to systematic psychological abuse and that her cooperation in exposing the truth had prevented a wrongful murder conviction. David's case was more complex. While the murder charges were dropped due to Sarah's reappearance, prosecutors filed new charges related to insurance fraud, psychological abuse, and conspiracy. The evidence Elena provided supported a case for attempted fraud and emotional abuse, though the specific charges were complicated by the fact that his psychological manipulation campaign hadn't involved direct threats or physical violence. The ultimate resolution saw David pleading guilty to insurance fraud and receiving a sentence of 2 years in prison plus restitution to the insurance company and law enforcement agencies that had investigated Sarah's staged death. While the penalty didn't fully reflect the severity of his psychological abuse campaign, it provided some measure of justice and established legal precedent for prosecuting emotional manipulation in domestic relationships. Amanda faced professional consequences for her role in the manipulation campaign, losing her nursing license and facing civil liability for her participation in the scheme to portray Sarah as mentally unstable. Her cooperation with investigators helped establish the timeline and extent of David's psychological abuse, but it didn't protect her from the professional and personal consequences of her actions. Sarah Mitchell officially reclaimed her legal identity 6 months after resurfacing, though she chose to continue using Elena Parker as her professional name in her work helping other abuse survivors. The transition back to her original identity was emotionally complex, requiring her to integrate 5 years of growth and independence with the person she'd been before disappearing. The nonprofit organization Elena had established continued to operate, now with the added credibility of being run by someone who'd successfully escaped an abusive relationship through extreme but effective means. Her story became a powerful tool for advocating for better understanding, recognition, and legal reconciliation of psychological abuse in domestic settings.
Educating others about psychological manipulation and the importance of recognizing emotional abuse as a serious form of domestic violence. The relationship with Jake evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping other families affected by psychological abuse. His decision to maintain contact with Sarah while completely cutting ties with David demonstrated his clear understanding of where responsibility lay for the family's destruction. Lisa and Sarah's parents welcomed her back with a mixture of joy and confusion that took years to fully resolve. While they were overjoyed that she was alive, they struggled to understand why she hadn't trusted them enough to seek help through conventional means rather than staging her death. The healing process required extensive family therapy and honest discussions about the isolation that psychological abuse creates for its victims. The financial restitution required as part of Sarah's sentence was significant but manageable given the success of her consulting business and nonprofit work. The insurance company recovered the money that would have been paid to David, while law enforcement agencies received compensation for the resources spent investigating her staged death and the subsequent murder case. 5 years after resurfacing, Sarah reflected on her journey from victim to survivor to advocate with a complexity of emotions that matched the extraordinary nature of her experience. She'd saved herself from psychological destruction through illegal but effective means, prevented an innocent person from being wrongly convicted of murder, and built a life dedicated to helping other victims of abuse find safer paths to freedom. The cost of her survival had been enormous, involving years of separation from everyone she loved and serious legal consequences that would follow her permanently. But the alternative had been remaining trapped in a relationship designed to destroy her psychologically, with the very real possibility that David's manipulation campaign would have eventually succeeded in driving her to actual suicide. Sarah's story became a powerful example of how psychological abuse can be just as destructive as physical violence, and how victims sometimes need to take extreme measures to protect themselves when conventional resources fail to address the subtle but devastating nature of emotional manipulation. Her experience highlighted the need for better legal protections for victims of psychological abuse and more sophisticated understanding of how emotional manipulation can drive people to desperate measures. The woman who'd once stood in her bathroom practicing her own eulogy in a Riverside bathroom mirror had discovered that sometimes the only way to survive psychological warfare is to disappear completely, rebuild yourself from scratch, and return when you're strong enough to face the consequences of your survival. Sarah Mitchell had died to save herself, but Elena Parker had lived to save others from experiencing the same psychological destruction she'd endured. David's attempts to manipulate her to suicide had ultimately failed, but they'd also transformed her into someone who understood the mechanics of psychological abuse well enough to help others recognize and escape similar situations. The victory wasn't just personal survival, but the prevention of future victims through education, advocacy, and the legal precedents established by her case. 10 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell first heard her husband tell his mistress that his suicidal wife had finally done what she'd been threatening to do. The woman who sat in her Cleveland office on this crisp autumn morning bore little resemblance to the broken person who had once practiced her own eulogy in a Riverside bathroom mirror. Elena Parker, as she was now known professionally, had become one of the country's leading experts on psychological abuse recovery. But the journey to this moment had required a transformation that few people could fully comprehend. The morning brought news that would have devastated Sarah Mitchell, but barely registered with the woman she'd become. David had died of a heart attack in his sleep at the age of 53, ending a life that had been marked by manipulation, betrayal, and ultimately, consequences he'd never anticipated when he began his campaign to drive his wife to suicide. Amanda had found his body and called the paramedics, but there was nothing anyone could do. The man who had once orchestrated such elaborate psychological warfare had succumbed to the stress and health problems that his own destructive choices had created. Jake called to deliver the news personally, his voice carrying a mixture of sadness and relief that reflected the complicated emotions surrounding his father's passing. "I thought you should hear it from me before you saw it in the news," he said quietly. "I know this might bring up difficult feelings even after everything that's happened." Elena's response surprised even herself with its lack of emotional intensity. "Thank you for calling, Jake. I appreciate you thinking of me during what must be a difficult time for you." The calmness in her voice reflected genuine peace rather than suppressed anger or hidden satisfaction. David's death felt like the final chapter of a story that had already reached its natural conclusion years earlier. The funeral arrangements revealed the isolation that David's choices had ultimately created for him,
Amanda organized a small service with minimal attendance, reflecting the reality that his manipulative behavior had alienated most people who had once cared about him. Jake attended out of obligation rather than grief, and very few coworkers or neighbors felt compelled to pay their respects to someone who had proven himself capable of such calculated cruelty.
Supposed instability with his coworkers. He keeps telling everyone that I'm having a nervous breakdown, but I feel like I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years, the client explained during their video consultation. The problem is that he's been building this narrative for so long that even my own family is starting to believe I need psychiatric intervention. Elena recognized the familiar pattern of reputation destruction and psychological manipulation that she'd experienced with David. The case served as a reminder that while her own situation had reached its conclusion, countless other women were currently trapped in similar cycles of emotional abuse and systematic isolation. Her work had become more than personal healing. It was a mission to prevent others from reaching the desperate point where staging their own death seemed like the only path to freedom. The nonprofit Elena had established, now called the Phoenix Foundation, had grown from a small Cleveland operation into a national organization with offices in 12 major cities. The foundation provided legal assistance, counseling services, and practical support for women escaping psychologically abusive relationships, while also training law enforcement and mental health professionals to recognize the subtle signs of emotional manipulation. Elena's unique perspective as someone who had survived extreme psychological abuse through equally extreme measures gave her credibility that traditional advocates often lacked. Her willingness to discuss the darkest aspects of her experience, including the decision to fake her own death, provided validation for clients who felt that their situations were too complicated or unusual for conventional help. The Foundation's most innovative program involved training sessions for police officers, judges, and social workers about the realities of psychological abuse and the sophisticated manipulation tactics that abusers often employed. Elena's case study had become a standard part of the curriculum, demonstrating how emotional manipulation could drive victims to desperate measures that appeared irrational to outside observers. People don't fake their own deaths because they're mentally ill, Elena would explain during training sessions. They do it because they've been systematically convinced that disappearing is the only way to stop someone from destroying their psychological well-being. When conventional escape routes have been blocked through reputation destruction and social isolation, victims sometimes resort to extreme solutions that protect them from further harm. The legal precedents established by Elena's case had influenced how courts handled psychological abuse claims and had led to new legislation in several states recognizing emotional manipulation as a form of domestic violence. The changes were incremental but significant, providing legal frameworks for addressing abuse that left no physical evidence but caused profound psychological damage. Jake had become one of Elena's strongest supporters and had joined the Phoenix Foundation's board of directors after completing his computer science degree. His technical expertise had been crucial in developing digital security protocols that helped abuse victims protect their communications and financial information from monitoring by their abusers. His personal experience with his father's manipulation had given him insight into the tactics that abusers used to maintain control over their victims. Sarah saved herself, but she also saved me from growing up thinking that psychological manipulation was normal behavior in relationships, Jake often said when speaking at Phoenix Foundation events.
Her courage to expose what was happening in our house taught me to recognize unhealthy patterns and to trust my own perceptions when something doesn't feel right. Elena's relationship with her family had been permanently altered by her staged death, but the healing process had ultimately strengthened their connections in unexpected ways. Lisa had become an advocate for mental health awareness, using her sister's story to highlight the difference between genuine depression and the psychological symptoms created by systematic abuse. Their parents had struggled with the deception but had eventually come to understand the impossible situation that had driven Elena to such extreme measures. "I wish she had felt safe enough to tell us what was really happening," Elena's mother had said during a television interview about domestic abuse awareness. "But I understand now that psychological abusers work very hard to isolate their victims from support systems." Sarah felt like she had no one to turn to because David had spent months convincing everyone that she was mentally unstable. The media attention surrounding Elena's story had created opportunities to educate the public about psychological abuse, but it had also meant living with permanent loss of privacy and ongoing scrutiny of her choices. The decision to maintain her Elena Parker identity in professional settings had been practical as well as emotional. It provided some distance from the intense public interest in Sarah Mitchell's story, while allowing her to build credibility based on her current work rather than her past victimization. Amanda had reached out to Elena several years after David's trial, seeking forgiveness and offering to share her perspective about the manipulation campaign she'd participated in. The conversation had been difficult, but ultimately healing for both women, as Amanda acknowledged her role in enabling David's psychological abuse, while Elena recognized that Amanda had also been a victim of David's manipulation, albeit a more willing one. "I thought I was helping David deal with his unstable wife," Amanda had explained during their meeting. "I didn't understand that he was creating the instability he was complaining about. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was too invested in the relationship to admit that I'd been helping him destroy an innocent person." Amanda's testimony had been crucial in several legal cases involving psychological abuse, and she had become an advocate for professional training that would help healthcare workers recognize when patients' family members might be providing misleading information about their mental health. Her nursing license had been permanently revoked, but her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes had contributed to positive changes in how medical professionals approached domestic abuse situations. The financial restitution Elena had been required to pay as part of her sentence had been completed years earlier, but the legal consequences of her staged death had followed her permanently. Background checks always revealed her fraud conviction, limiting some employment opportunities and requiring ongoing explanation of her circumstances. The trade-off had been acceptable given the alternative of remaining trapped in David's psychological manipulation, but it served as a constant reminder of the price she'd paid for her freedom. Elena's current life bore no resemblance to the existence she'd endured as Sarah Mitchell. Her work was meaningful and impactful, her relationships were built on honesty and mutual respect, and her financial independence provided security that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. The transformation had required losing everything she'd built to Sarah Mitchell, but it had also allowed her to discover strengths and capabilities she'd never known she possessed. The Phoenix Foundation's latest initiative involved partnering with technology companies to develop apps and online resources that could help abuse victims document psychological manipulation and access support systems safely. Elena's experience with digital security and identity protection had informed the development of tools that could help women plan escapes from abusive relationships without alerting their abusers to their intentions. As Elena reflected on the decade that had passed since she'd first overheard David discussing her supposed suicide with Amanda, she felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with his death. The woman who had once been so thoroughly undermined that she'd practiced her own eulogy had built a life dedicated to ensuring that other women never reached that point of desperation. David's attempts to drive her to suicide had ultimately failed, not just because she'd found a way to escape, but because his actions had created someone who was committed to preventing similar manipulation from succeeding against other victims. The Phoenix Foundation had helped hundreds of women escape psychologically abusive relationships through conventional means, eliminating the need for the extreme measures Elena had been forced to take. The legacy of Sarah Mitchell's staged death would continue through the work of the Phoenix Foundation and the legal precedents that had been established by her case. Future victims of psychological abuse would have better resources, stronger legal protections, and greater understanding from law enforcement and mental health professionals. Elena's survival had been personal, but its impact would protect countless others from experiencing the same systematic destruction she'd endured. The woman David had tried to drive to suicide had not only survived, but had thrived in ways that honored every person who hadn't been as fortunate.
Elena represented proof that psychological abusers could be defeated, that victims could become advocates, and that sometimes the most extreme survival strategies could create the most powerful forces for positive change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.